Have you ever had that moment where you realize the person who's supposed to love you the most is actually your biggest problem? That's what happened on what should have been the happiest week of my life. My honeymoon. The trip my husband Jake and I had been saving for and dreaming about for 2 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should have seen it coming. The warning signs were all there, flashing like those giant billboards in Times Square. But when you're in love and planning a wedding, you tend to ignore the red flags waving right in front of your face. At least, that's what I did. Jake and I had been together for 3 years before he proposed. He was everything I'd ever wanted: kind, funny, ambitious. And he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world. The only problem? His mother, Linda. From the moment we met, Linda made it clear that no woman would ever be good enough for her precious son. At first, it was subtle. She'd accidentally call me by his ex-girlfriend's name. She'd reminisce about all the wonderful girls he'd dated before me. She'd make these little comments that seemed innocent on the surface but cut deep if you really understood what she meant. "Oh, you're wearing that to dinner? How brave of you." Jake always said he wanted to marry someone who could cook like me. Do you cook, Kate? My Jake has always been attracted to athletic girls. Do you ever work out, dear? Jake would defend me when he noticed, but Linda was clever. Most of her digs happened when he stepped away or was distracted. And when I'd bring it up later, I'd sound petty or paranoid. Even I started to wonder if I was imagining things. Then came the wedding planning. Oh boy, that's when Linda really showed her true colors. She insisted on being involved in every decision, from the venue to the napkin colors. She'd schedule cake tastings without telling me, then act hurt when I couldn't drop everything to attend. She surprised me by ordering invitations, completely different from the ones we'd chosen, and had them sent to our guests before I even saw them. When I finally broke down in tears to Jake, he promised to talk to her. And he did. Things improved for about a week. Then Linda landed in the hospital with supposed chest pains the day before our final venue walkthrough. Tests showed nothing wrong, but Jake was so shaken up that he spent the whole weekend at her house, missing our appointment entirely. I tried to be understanding. I really did. She was his mother, after all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that her emergencies were always too perfectly timed. The wedding day itself was a battlefield disguised as a celebration. Linda showed up at my bridal suite unannounced, criticizing my hair and suggesting last-minute changes to the ceremony. She wore white. Not quite a wedding dress, but close enough that several guests commented on it. During the reception, she gave a 20-minute speech about how no woman would ever love Jake as much as she did. She even managed to spill red wine on my dress right before the photographer was scheduled to take our sunset photos. But we made it through. We were married. And we had our honeymoon to look forward to. 2 glorious weeks in Bali, far away from Linda and her drama. It was going to be perfect. The night before our flight, Jake got a call. Linda was crying, saying she felt abandoned and alone. Jake spent 3 hours on the phone with her, reassuring her that we'd call every day and bring her back something special. I bit my tongue. It was just one phone call, and then we'd be free. We arrived at the airport the next morning, exhausted, but excited. As we waited to board, I noticed Jake checking his phone constantly, his face growing increasingly concerned. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Mom's not answering her phone," he said. "I've called 3 times." "She's probably sleeping," I suggested. "It's still early back home." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. We boarded the plane, settled into our seats, and I finally allowed myself to relax. 16 hours of flight time, and then paradise awaited us. I closed my eyes, feeling the tension leave my body for the first time in months. That's when I heard it. That voice. the voice that had been the soundtrack to my nightmares for the past year. "Jake! Jakey! I made it!" I opened my eyes to see Linda, breathless and beaming, standing in the aisle beside our row. She was clutching a carry-on bag and wearing a ridiculous straw hat with Ballybound written across the brim in glitter. "Mom?" Jake looked as shocked as I felt. "What are you doing here?" "Surprise!" she trilled, loud enough for half the plane to hear. "I decided to join you. Wasn't that thoughtful of me? I knew you'd be worried about me all alone, so I thought this would be the perfect solution." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. "But how did you know where we were going?" Jake asked, confusion etched across his face. "We kept it a secret," Linda waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I have my ways. A mother always knows. Plus, I might have peeked at your itinerary when I was helping with the wedding arrangements. Isn't this exciting? The three of us together in paradise." The three of us, on our honeymoon. I looked at Jake, waiting for him to say something, to tell her this was inappropriate, to defend our right to privacy on what was supposed to be the most romantic trip of our lives. But he just sat there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as Linda shoved her bag into the overhead compartment and squeezed into the seat across the aisle, chattering about all the activities she'd planned for us. In that moment, as the plane began to taxi down the runway, I realized this wasn't just about our honeymoon. This was about the rest of our lives. If I didn't find a way to establish boundaries now, Linda would always be there, inserting herself into every private moment, every milestone, every anniversary. I took a deep breath and squeezed Jake's hand. This honeymoon had just become something very different from what we'd planned. It had become a turning point, and one way or another, things were going to change. I glanced over at Jake as the plane climbed through the clouds. His face was a mixture of confusion and that familiar guilt I'd seen so many times before. Linda had finally settled into her seat across the aisle, flipping through the in-flight magazine and occasionally making loud comments about the outrageous drink prices. "Jake," I whispered, leaning close to his ear. "We need to talk about this." He nodded, his eyes darting nervously between me and his mother. I know. I'm as surprised as you are. I had no idea she was planning this." "This is our honeymoon," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not a family vacation." "I'll talk to her," he promised, squeezing my hand. "As soon as we land, I'll explain that this isn't appropriate." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But I'd heard those exact words so many times over the past year, and nothing ever changed. Still, what choice did I have? We were already in the air, trapped in a metal tube with Linda for the next 15 hours. The flight was excruciating. Linda managed to sweet-talk the flight attendant into letting her switch seats with the person next to Jake, claiming she had terrible anxiety and needed to be near her son. That left me separated from my husband of exactly 2 days, watching as Linda rested her head on his shoulder and fell asleep clutching his arm. I tried to distract myself with movies, but my mind kept returning to the same question. How had it come to this? How had I allowed this woman to hijack not just our wedding, but now our honeymoon too? By the time we landed in Bali, I was exhausted, frustrated, and determined to salvage what was left of our trip. As we waited for our luggage, I pulled Jake aside. "You need to tell her to get her own hotel," I said firmly. "I don't care how you do it, but she cannot stay with us." "Of course," he agreed quickly. "I'll handle it." But when we arrived at our villa, a beautiful private bungalow with an infinity pool overlooking the ocean, Linda was right behind us, wheeling her suitcase up the path. "Mom," Jake began awkwardly, "Kate and I were thinking—" "Isn't this gorgeous?" Linda interrupted, brushing past him and entering our villa like she owned it. "Oh, look at that view! I made the right choice booking this place. My head snapped up. You booked this. Well, I made a few little changes to your original reservation, she said, wandering through our honeymoon suite. The place you picked was so isolated. This resort has so many more activities. And I upgraded you to this villa. My treat. I looked at Jake in disbelief. This explained why the driver had been confused when we gave him our original hotel name. There are 2 bedrooms, Linda continued, oblivious to the tension. I took the liberty of taking the master suite since it has the better view. You 2 lovebirds won't mind the smaller room, will you? You'll be too busy being newlyweds to notice. She laughed at her own joke. That was it. I'd reached my breaking point. No, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. Absolutely not. Linda's smile faltered. Excuse me? This is our honeymoon, Linda, not yours. We appreciate the gesture, but Jake and I will be staying in the master bedroom, and tomorrow we'll be helping you find your own accommodation. The room went deadly silent. Linda's face transformed, her saccharine smile melting into something cold and hard. After all I've done for you, she said quietly. After all the money I've spent making your little wedding perfect, this is how you thank me? By kicking me out? Mom, nobody's kicking you out, Jake interjected, his voice pleading. But Kate's right, this is our honeymoon. We need our privacy. Linda's eyes filled with tears. Right on cue. I see how it is. She's turned you against me. My own son. I watched as Jake's resolve began to crumble. I'd seen this play out too many times before. Linda would cry, Jake would comfort her, and somehow I'd end up being the villain. Not this time. I'm going for a walk, I announced, grabbing my purse. You 2 sort this out, but when I come back, I expect things to be settled. I didn't wait for a response. I needed air, space, time to think. I wandered down to the beach, watching as the sun began to set over the ocean. This was supposed to be romantic, magical. Instead, I was alone on my honeymoon while my husband comforted his mother. After an hour, I returned to the villa, bracing myself for round 2. But instead, I found Jake sitting alone on the terrace, a half-empty bottle of wine in front of him. Where's Linda? I asked, looking around cautiously, half expecting her to jump out from behind a palm tree. She went to the resort restaurant to give us some time alone, he said, making air quotes. But not before reminding me that she has late-stage hypertension and the stress of finding new accommodations might literally kill her. I sat down beside him, taking the glass he offered. And I told her that we'd look at options tomorrow, but that she couldn't stay here with us for the full 2 weeks. He looked at me nervously. It was the best compromise I could manage. It wasn't enough, not even close, but it was something, a small step. The next 3 days fell into an uncomfortable pattern. Linda would disappear for a few hours, giving us the illusion of privacy, then reappear at the most inopportune moments. She'd knock on our bedroom door early in the morning, claiming she'd heard strange noises and wanted to make sure we were okay. She'd insert herself into our dinner reservations, always with some excuse about why she couldn't eat alone, and the constant checking up on me. That was the worst part. If Jake and I separated for even a moment, if I went to the bathroom or to get a drink from the bar, Linda would materialize at my side. Just making sure you're behaving yourself, she'd say with that brittle laugh of hers. A beautiful girl like you in a place like this. Men might get ideas. I promised Jake I'd keep an eye on you. The implication was clear. She didn't trust me. In her mind, I was some sort of gold digger who might run off with the first wealthy tourist who crossed my path. By day 4, I was at my breaking point. Jake and I had barely had a moment alone, let alone any of the romantic experiences we'd planned. Every attempt to discuss the situation with him ended the same way, with promises that he'd talk to her tomorrow, or that things would get better. That night, as Linda monopolized yet another dinner conversation with stories about Jake's childhood, I made my decision. Something had to change. And if Jake wouldn't stand up to his mother, then I would have to take matters into my own hands. I excused myself from the table, claiming I needed to use the restroom. Instead, I found our waiter and slipped him a note, along with a generous tip. Then I returned to the table, a plan forming in my mind. This honeymoon wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. I returned to the table with a smile that felt foreign on my face after days of forced politeness. Linda was in the middle of telling Jake, for what must have been the 10th time, about how he'd won his 5th grade spelling bee by correctly spelling perseverance. "A word that still describes you perfectly, honey," she cooed, patting his hand. "You never give up on anything important, just like how you never gave up on finding the right girl, even after Caroline." She shot me a pointed look. Caroline was Jake's college girlfriend, whom Linda still referenced at every opportunity. "Actually," I interrupted, sliding back into my seat, "I have a surprise for both of you." Jake looked at me curiously. Linda's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I've arranged something special for tomorrow," I continued. "A private boat tour to Nusa Penida. We'll see the famous cliffs, swim with manta rays, visit the hidden beaches. It's supposed to be breathtaking." Jake's face lit up. "That sounds incredible, Kate." "A boat?" Linda frowned. "I don't do well on boats. I get terribly seasick." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that," I said, trying to sound disappointed. I had no idea. "Well, you can have the villa to yourself tomorrow, then. A nice day of relaxation might be just what you need." Linda's frown deepened. No, I'll manage. I'm sure they have medication for that sort of thing." "Are you certain?" I asked, concern dripping from my voice. "The guide mentioned the waters can get quite choppy. I wouldn't want you to be uncomfortable." "I said I'll manage," she snapped. The rest of dinner passed in relative peace, with Linda subdued by the prospect of tomorrow's boat trip. As we walked back to our villa, Jake squeezed my hand, whispering, "That was a great idea. Thank you." If only he knew. The next morning we woke early. I'd told them the boat left at 7 a.m. sharp, so we needed to be at the marina by 6:30. Linda emerged from her room looking decidedly pale, but determined. "I took 2 motion sickness pills," she announced, gripping her oversized beach bag like a shield. "I'm ready." The marina was bustling when we arrived. I led them confidently through the crowd, searching for our guide. "There he is," I said, pointing to a young Balinese man holding a sign that read, "Sunset Dreams Tour." "Sunset?" Linda questioned immediately. "I thought this was a day tour." "It is," I assured her. "Sunset Dreams is just the name of the company." Our guide, Wyan, greeted us warmly and led us to a sleek speedboat. "You are Kate?" he asked me. I nodded, slipping him an envelope. "Everything's arranged as discussed." He smiled knowingly. "Yes, of course. Please, come aboard." The boat ride was beautiful, if somewhat tense. Linda sat rigidly in her seat, eyes fixed on the horizon, occasionally sipping water and taking deep breaths. Jake was oblivious, pointing out flying fish and distant islands, his face alight with excitement. After about 40 minutes, Wyan slowed the boat as we approached a stunning secluded cove framed by towering cliffs. "We have arrived at our first stop," he announced. "Blue Lagoon. Very famous for snorkeling. Many beautiful fish and perhaps turtles if you are lucky." "It's breathtaking," Jake said, helping me stand as the boat gently rocked. "I think I'll stay on the boat," Linda murmured, her complexion now genuinely matching her green sundress. Are you sure, Mom? The water might make you feel better. I'm sure, she said firmly. Perfect. Jake and I climbed down into the crystal clear water, our snorkel masks in hand. As soon as we were out of earshot, I turned to him. So, there's something I should tell you about today's tour. His eyebrows rose. What's that? I took a deep breath. There isn't one. Not a full day tour, anyway. What do you mean? Wyan is taking us back to the resort in about 30 minutes, but he's not taking your mother back with us. Jake's eyes widened. Kate, what did you do? I arranged for her to have a different experience, I explained quickly. She'll be taken to Ubud, where she has a reservation at a beautiful wellness retreat. All expenses paid. For a week. You're stranding my mother in Ubud? His voice rose, and I hurriedly pulled him further from the boat. I'm giving us a chance to actually have a honeymoon, I corrected. Jake, this isn't normal. Your mother crashed our honeymoon. She's been monitoring me like I'm some kind of criminal. She's inserted herself into every moment that should have been just ours. But Ubud is hours away from our resort. Exactly, I said. And she'll be perfectly fine. The retreat is gorgeous. 5 stars, spa treatments, yoga classes, guided tours. Everything's taken care of. She might even enjoy it if she gives it a chance. I could see the conflict in his eyes. This feels wrong, Kate. What feels wrong is that we haven't had a single moment alone since we got married, I said quietly. What feels wrong is that I've had to share my husband with his mother on our honeymoon. What feels wrong is that you haven't been willing to set boundaries with her, even now. He was silent for a long moment, looking back at the boat where Linda sat hunched over, unaware of our conversation. Finally, he sighed. She's going to be furious. Probably, I agreed. But sometimes you have to choose, Jake. And right now, I need you to choose us. The hardest part was getting back on the boat and acting normal for the next 20 minutes. We pretended to snorkel, pointing out colorful fish to each other while my heart hammered in my chest. Would Jake change his mind? Would he warn Linda? Finally, Wyan called us back to the boat. Time to go to next location, he announced cheerfully. As we climbed aboard, Linda looked relieved. Thank goodness. Can we go somewhere with more stable ground next? Actually, Mrs. Henderson, Wyan said politely, I will be taking you to a different place. Very special retreat in Ubud. Very famous for healing and relaxation. The confusion on Linda's face quickly morphed to outrage as understanding dawned. She whirled on me. You planned this. Mom, Jake said, stepping between us. Kate and I need some time alone. This is our honeymoon. So you're abandoning me? Her voice rose dramatically, causing nearby boats to turn our way. In a foreign country? Your own mother? You're not being abandoned, I said calmly. You're being treated to a luxury spa retreat. The staff is expecting you. Everything's arranged and paid for. I don't believe this, she hissed. After everything I've done for you both. Jake, you can't seriously be considering this. I held my breath. This was the moment of truth. Jake took a deep breath. Mom, I love you. But Kate is right. This is our honeymoon. We deserve this time together. Linda's face contorted with fury. I see how it is. She's poisoned you against me. Fine. Fine. Take me to this retreat. She spat the last word like it was venom. Wyan, to his credit, maintained his professional smile through the entire exchange. Very good. We go now. 20 minutes later, Jake and I watched from the dock as Wyan's boat disappeared around the bend, with Linda still fuming on board. The silence that followed was deafening. Did we just do that? Jake whispered. We did, I confirmed, a mixture of guilt and relief washing over me. Are you okay? He turned to me, and for the first time since we'd arrived in Bali, I saw a genuine smile spread across his face. You know what? I think I am. We returned to our villa in a strange, lingering silence. The absence of Linda's constant chatter and hovering presence made the space feel almost unnaturally quiet. Jake kept checking his phone, a mix of worry and guilt shadowing his features. But beneath that, I could see something else. A subtle relaxation in his shoulders, a softness returning to his eyes when he looked at me. Do you think she's okay? He asked as we settled on the terrace with glasses of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. She's fine, I assured him. Wyan promised to personally ensure she got checked in properly, and I chose that retreat specifically because they cater to international guests. She'll probably be getting a massage and complaining about how it's not as good as the ones she gets back home. Jake laughed, a genuine, unrestrained laugh that I hadn't heard since before our wedding. You're probably right. She does love to complain about massages. See, she's in her element. His phone buzzed, and the smile vanished from his face. It's her, he said, staring at the screen like it might bite him. Are you going to answer? He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then, with a deep breath, he silenced the phone and placed it face down on the table. Not tonight. Tonight is just us. Something broke loose inside me then. A knot of tension I'd been carrying for so long I'd almost forgotten it was there. For the first time since we arrived in Bali, Jake was choosing us. Choosing me. That night was everything our honeymoon should have been from the start. We had a private dinner on the beach, toes in the sand, candles flickering around us. We talked and laughed and reconnected in ways that had felt impossible with Linda's constant presence. And later, in our bedroom, the master bedroom, we made love without worrying about his mother knocking on the door with another fabricated emergency. The next morning, Jake's phone showed 17 missed calls and 32 text messages. He scrolled through them with a grimace. That bad? I asked, peering over his shoulder. Worse, he admitted. She's threatening to call the embassy and report that she's been kidnapped. My stomach dropped. She wouldn't. She would. But don't worry, he added quickly. I'm handling it. He stepped out onto the terrace to make the call, and I tried not to eavesdrop, but it was impossible not to hear his voice rising and falling as he alternated between soothing and stern. When he came back inside, his expression was a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Crisis averted. I convinced her that making false reports to the embassy would only get her in trouble. She's agreed to stay at the retreat, but... He trailed off. But what? She wants me to come visit her tomorrow. Just for lunch, he added hastily, seeing my expression. I told her I'd come alone for a few hours, talk things through, make sure she's really okay, and then come back here to you. I wanted to object, to remind him that this was our honeymoon, that we'd only just reclaimed it. But I could see in his eyes that he needed this, needed to make peace with his decision, to reassure himself that his mother was truly all right. Okay, I agreed. A few hours. His face flooded with relief. Thank you for understanding, Kate. I promise it's just this once. And oddly enough, I believed him. Something had shifted between us. Some invisible barrier had been broken down. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, Jake was seeing his mother's behavior clearly, without the filter of guilt and obligation that had always colored his perception. The next day, I kissed him goodbye as he left for Ubud. Remember, just a few hours, I reminded him. And keep your phone on. I will, he promised. And when I get back, we'll do whatever you want. Snorkeling, hiking, dancing, anything. I spent the day pampering myself. A spa treatment, a quiet lunch by the pool, some shopping in the little boutiques near our resort. It was strange having time completely to myself, but liberating too. I realized how much of our relationship had been shaped by Linda's presence, how much mental and emotional energy I'd spent navigating her moods and manipulations. By late afternoon, I was back at our villa, watching the clock. Jake had been gone for 6 hours. The drive to Ubud was about 2 hours each way, which meant he'd spent maybe 2 hours with Linda. That seemed reasonable. But as 5 o'clock turned to 6, and 6 to 7, a familiar anxiety began to gnaw at me. Had Linda somehow convinced him to stay? Had she guilted him into spending the night at the retreat? Or worse, had she talked him into bringing her back to our villa? I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. My imagination ran wild with scenarios, each worse than the last. Just as I was about to call the retreat directly, I heard the villa door open. Jake stumbled in, looking exhausted but oddly triumphant. "Where have you been?" I demanded, relief and irritation battling for dominance. "I've been worried sick." He collapsed onto the couch beside me. "I'm sorry. My phone died, and the traffic coming back was a nightmare. But Kate, ... He took my hands in his eyes shining with a strange intensity. "I did it. I finally stood up to her." "What happened?" "It started out okay. She was playing the victim, of course, but seemed to be adjusting. The retreat is actually beautiful, and they've been treating her like royalty. But then she started in on you, saying how you'd manipulated me, how you were trying to come between us, how I was making a terrible mistake." I held my breath, waiting for the familiar pattern. Jake defending me half-heartedly, then giving in to keep the peace. And I just snapped. He continued, not in an angry way. It was like everything suddenly became crystal clear. I told her that you were my wife now, that her behavior on our honeymoon was completely inappropriate, and that if she wanted to have a relationship with us going forward, things would have to change. "How did she take it?" I asked, half afraid of the answer. "Not well," he admitted with a rueful smile. "There were tears, accusations, the whole Linda special. She even threatened to cut me out of her will." "Jake, I'm so sorry." "Don't be," he interrupted. "Because after all that drama, the strangest thing happened. When she realized I wasn't backing down, that her usual tactics weren't working, she actually calmed down. We had a real conversation, maybe the first honest one we've had in years." "Really?" I couldn't keep the skepticism from my voice. "I'm not saying she's magically changed," he clarified. "But I think she finally understands that something has to give. I made it clear that I'm not choosing between you and her. I'm choosing a healthy relationship with both of you, which means she needs to respect our boundaries." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But I'd seen Linda in action too many times to think one conversation, however heartfelt, would transform her. "So what happens now?" I asked cautiously. "Now," he said, pulling me close. "We finish our honeymoon. Just the two of us. Linda's staying at the retreat for the full week, and then flying home directly from Denpasar. I've already arranged her transport to the airport." "And you're okay with that?" "Really okay?" He looked at me, his eyes more serious than I'd ever seen them. "More than okay. Kate, I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was happening. I've been making excuses for her behavior my entire life, telling myself it was just her way of showing love. But watching how she treated you, especially during our wedding and honeymoon, I couldn't ignore it anymore." For the first time since we'd arrived in Bali, I felt myself fully relax. The remaining days of our honeymoon passed in a blur of sunsets and sandy beaches, of lazy mornings and adventurous afternoons. We hiked to waterfalls, explored ancient temples, took a cooking class, and spent hours simply being together, reconnecting without Linda's shadow looming over us. On our last night, as we sat on the beach watching our final Balinese sunset, Jake turned to me with a smile. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For loving me enough to fight for us, even when it meant doing something drastic." I leaned my head on his shoulder. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." "You won't have to," he promised. "Things will be different when we get home. I can't say she'll change overnight, but I will. No more letting her cross boundaries. No more putting her feelings above ours." I believed him. Not because Linda would suddenly transform into a doting, respectful mother-in-law. I wasn't that naive. But because Jake had finally seen the truth, had chosen to protect our marriage even when it was difficult. That was all I'd ever wanted. We flew home a week later, tanned, rested, and more solidly connected than ever before. Linda was notably absent from the welcome wagon, but a stiff note awaited us at our apartment, informing us that she'd forgiven us and would be available for Sunday dinner when we were ready to apologize properly. Jake read it aloud, then met my eyes with a smile. Without a word, he tore the note in half and dropped it in the trash. Our honeymoon hadn't gone according to plan. Not even close. But in the end, we'd gotten something more valuable than 2 perfect weeks in paradise. We'd found our voice as a couple. We'd established boundaries that would shape our marriage for years to come. And that, I realized as Jake pulled me into his arms in our own home, was worth more than all the Balinese sunsets in the world. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching my story about how my mother-in-law crashed our honeymoon and how we left her stranded at a retreat. If you've ever had to deal with boundary-stomping in-laws or family members, I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had to take drastic measures to protect your relationship? What was your breaking point? Sometimes the hardest part of marriage isn't the relationship between you and your spouse. It's managing the other relationships around you. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about navigating complicated family dynamics and learning to stand up for yourself. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload every day. Remember, you can't change other people, but you can change how you respond to them. The question is, are you ready to draw those lines in the sand? Share your thoughts below.